What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to another Bus Driver Experience. Today, I'm joined by Scott Solomon. He is a biologist, professor, science communicator. He teaches ecology, evolutionary biology, and scientific communication. He is the author of Future Humans, which I've read for the third time now because I had him back on the show. And it's an insight into the science of our continuing evolution. And it's an incredible read. And I'm excited to bring Dr. Stockton, right?
Yep.
The title is always important. I always give people, whether they're teachers or professors or actual medical doctors, I always call them doc. People are like, why do you do that? It's like, it's out of respect. They had to go and put their time in to get that thing, to get that degree. So how are you doing today?
I'm doing all right, thanks.
I hope everybody who is watching can see, or if you are listening to this, you got to go watch the video. We are not live. We're live from the Amazon, where you actually worked on one of your trips back a year ago. And it's funny that I think we were both in the same area of the Amazon when I was down there in 2015, and you were down there on a research project for the university.
Yeah, that's right. This was a trip with a group of Rice alumni, and I had done some research in the area as well, going back to, I guess it was 2004. It's just an incredible part of the world. Just amazing.
It really is. I mean, even it's funny. We both detailed and described the same way we got there. You go 2 hours until the road ends. Then you get on a boat. I mean, ours is powered by a little lawnmower that gets put into the into the river, and then that pushes you forward. And then you just keep going until you get to where you have to go. It's amazing. That river is just so big, so massive, and just the amount of wildlife. It's almost weird when you're down there, because even like in Colombia too. There's just so much rainforest. There's so much lush, beautiful, jungle and forest habitats. And, it's weird once you're there and you never see, at least I didn't see that, anything being torn down. But, the videos.
Well, yeah, I mean,
God.
I was just going to say, I was actually at this site here during the height of the fires that were very much in the news last summer across the Amazon. And so I was really aware of that as we were in the region, and was really trying to keep an eye out for that. And as we were flying in and out, I was, I had a window seat, and I was looking out to try to see if I could see any evidence of fires. And luckily we couldn't where we were, but it emphasizes what you're saying about how vast the region is. I mean, even though a lot of the region was experiencing fires at that time, there was nothing that we could see in our region, which was encouraging, but nevertheless, we know that those problems were happening elsewhere.
Yeah, I hope whatever the case may be, I know it's a blend and a mix of increasing agriculture, whether it is for soy or whether it's for livestock. It's a wide range of things that, or it's just, human population, the need to continuously feed our machine, whatever you want to call it, capitalism, our markets, our economy. The only way to go is continuous growth. And, it's kind of impeding on the world around us. As much as we are in control as a species on this planet, we can really dictate, how our environments, we can be very in control of our environments. But, what we're seeing with this pandemic is, we can only push that so far till something, I wouldn't call it a correction. It's just it's almost like a perfect storm. I mean, how would you describe it? Like,
yeah, I mean, and there are actually, I mean, to tie the two topics together, there are connections between what's happening in wild places like the Amazon and the pandemic we're experiencing, because we've known even before the COVID-19 pandemic that a lot of the diseases that we face as humans have come about when a disease that had been infecting an animal host switches hosts and starts to infect humans. And those types of events are more likely the more that we make incursions into these wild places, the places that these wild animals exist. So unfortunately, it is one of the expected consequences of deforestation, of the wildlife trade, of increased human population sizes, that we experience these new emerging infectious diseases. Yeah.
Now, isn't it two ways? Because isn't just agriculture and livestock since, let's say Mesopotamia 8,000 years ago, and we start living in these clustered areas, that, once we start living with these livestock and living with these animals, I think what smallpox comes from cows or pigs. I'm not really sure, but I think it's just being that closely tied with mammals. Diseases like a COVID-19, like a coronavirus, like an H1N1, can easily jump from species to species. I don't know. Mammalians are species, or is that a class of kingdom of the animals?
Right, right. So you're right. It can be mammals or also birds. So most of these infectious diseases, you mentioned a few of them, but there's also, influenza, obviously, but also, HIV, right? Ebola, the plague, anthrax. All of these are diseases that were infecting either a bird or a mammal. And you're right that in some cases it is livestock. But in other cases, it's wild animals that we come into contact with one way or another.
And it's remarkable. I mean, especially because rats. We would forget that we use rats a lot to test on whether it's going to be a new vaccine or even makeup. I mean, we test a lot of things on those because they have a very similar, I guess, makeup, genetic makeup to us that we can kind of test out what our side effects, negative or positive, going to be. And then you think about, what is it? Millions, tens of millions live within us in these cities, but they're also like big carriers of diseases that can get spread and passed on to us. Like you mentioned the plague, the bubonic plague, it took, 5, 10, 15, 20 years, but once it made it from Central Asia over, it just ravaged, was it Europe, 2/3 of the population perished, it's, so again, it's nothing new, but, why is it that a lot of these things can be traced back towards, I wouldn't say all of them, we were talking about swine flu, it was Mexican or American pigs that had that one passed over. But why is the majority of them coming from Asia or Central Asia?
Well, that's a good question. I'm probably not the best person to answer that question. I mean, I think it probably has to do with a combination of the exact types of animals that are people are coming into contact with. Their human population densities might be a factor as well. You've got some of the highest population densities in the world in some parts of Asia, but I think you're right. These diseases can come from anywhere. And it's really difficult to predict where the next one is going to come from. I mean, we know though that there will continue to be new emerging infectious diseases essentially forever, right? I mean, as long as we are living here on Earth, which is another possible topic that we got into last time. But
Yeah.
we are going to always have new emerging infectious diseases as long as we share this planet with birds and mammals. So COVID-19, unfortunately, is not going to be the last of these new infectious diseases that we'll face.
Yeah, and I want people to know. I mean, wet markets, aren't unique to just Asia. I mean, I know we both been to South America. I'm sure you've seen, a wide range of things, especially being in the Amazon, that are skinned and hanging from, the street with blood, the blood of the animal just dripping right in there. It's common, it's
Sure.
prevalent, and a lot of people, got to put their stereotypes and biases down because most of these people are doing this either because they don't have food, they don't have much stuff to eat, or they don't have a market uh, to make money. And for some reason, there is a ridiculous demand on just very exotic products, tigers, rhino horn, and which is sold in these markets. So, it's unfortunate, but people have to, understand, the circumstances, situations that, very unprivileged people have to go through to make a living and
That's
to
right.
eat.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I think it's it's very difficult to put yourself in that situation if you come from a more privileged background. But yeah, people have to feed their families, and if the best option for feeding your family is to go off into the forest and bring back an animal that you can feed your family with for a couple days or longer, or to bring back an animal that you'd be able to sell at a market because people elsewhere in the world are willing to pay a lot of money for it. Well, that in turn allows you to buy, food and supplies for your family for a long time. And that's what drives people around the world is, wanting to care for themselves and their families. And so, the best thing we can do is to try to create other opportunities for those people, improve their economies and their access to resources so that there isn't that need.
Mm-hmm. There's a deeper topic. Before we go into, the book again, Evolution, I wanted to take it back one more time. Because I know a lot of people have doubt on you know, the passing or the jumping of the disease from, in the mammalian animal kingdom. Maybe could you explain a little bit more and deeper, the biology side of how and why these things are so similar, or at least why these diseases can spread between very similar species within the same kingdoms? Like we said, and
Sure.
birds, which are not in the same, are not mammals themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. So as you were saying before, it's quite common actually for infectious diseases to jump hosts. What biologists refer to as a zoonosis is the technical term, but a more friendlier term might be spillover. There's a great book, actually a popular book by a science writer, David Quammen, called Spillover, which gives a fantastic account of sort of the many examples of how these types of diseases have switched hosts. And we're talking about diseases that might be caused by a virus, as is the case for the coronavirus that causes COVID-19. In the case of HIV, or it could be a bacterium, or it could be a protist, which is a single-celled eukaryotic organism. It's actually more similar to our cells. But in either case, these infectious diseases are parasites. They make their living by taking resources from a host, and they can't live without a host. This is very much true in the case of viruses. Viruses, in general, cannot replicate on their own. They require a host in order to replicate. And biologists actually even debate whether they should be considered living things or not, because they lack the ability to do the basic function of reproduction on their own. They have to have a host in order to reproduce. And as you can imagine, the host's immune systems are pretty well attuned to trying to prevent that from happening. So what you get is this kind of arms race between parasites and hosts. And because of that, the hosts are always getting better and better at trying to prevent the infection of these parasites. And in turn, the parasites get better and better at infiltrating the defenses of the hosts. One of the things that results in is a sort of a specialization between a parasite and its host. Most parasites are really only capable of infecting certain types of hosts because they have to be so good at getting past those defenses. And that's why it's not typically possible for the same type of disease to infect a human and a very distantly related animal, like, say, a reptile or a fish. Those are so different from us that the host would have such a very different type of immune system, and those parasites are unlikely to be able to infect both types of hosts. But we're close enough in our biology to other mammals, to many other mammals, and even to birds, which are still fairly distantly related to us, but our bodies function in similar ways. So what it means is that these parasites are able to switch hosts and start to infect this new host. And so that's sort of the very basic biology of it. I guess we could get into some more specifics if you're interested.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you mentioned, there's certain targets or certain animals. I include us in there. We're talking about animals. What makes us prime targets for disease?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that makes humans a prime target for disease is just that there's so many of us, right? I mean, we're coming up on 8 billion people in the human population, and with so many of us, it just means that we're a bigger bullseye for an infectious disease that needs a host. But other factors include the fact that we're social, right? I mean, humans We
Hmm.
live in societies in which we, at least normally, interact closely with one another. We come into close physical contact with other people on a regular basis. I mean, we've all become very keenly aware of this now because we're trying to do all the social distancing to prevent that spread. But the reality is that that's built into our DNA. We are social organisms, and all of those interactions that we have with other people, whether it's a handshake or a kiss on the cheek or just, a pat on the shoulder or sitting next to somebody for a meal, all of those are opportunities for a host for a parasite to switch from one host to another. And then add on top of that our globalization that we've seen in the last century or so, that makes it so easy for a parasite to make it from one continent to another, just by being on a host that hops on an airplane and goes for a transcontinental flight. So you combine all of those things. Oh, and the fact that actually genetically we are actually very similar to one another. From one human to another, there are very few genetic differences. And that actually makes us a even easier target for a parasite. When I say very few genetic differences, what I mean is that although, obviously there are, some differences in the genomes of people from, different backgrounds, different regions, different ethnicities or races. Um, if you compare the differences among different humans to the differences among our closest living relatives, chimpanzees, gorillas, it turns out that individual chimpanzees have far more differences from one to another than what we see even between the most distantly related human populations. We are very, very genetically similar to one another. And that just makes it that much easier for a parasite to sort of crack the code, so to speak, and figure out ways to infect one of us, which makes it easy for them to infect most, if not all of us.
Yeah, I think we mentioned that last time on the show. Because we branched out from, we call it Southeastern Africa, that the farther the humans that went away, let's say all the way to the tip of South America, are going to have less diversity in their genome because there's less of them who have made it there and less who have multiplied from that scenario. So would anything, people in Africa, even today, have more diverse, if anything, they would have the most diverse DNA or genetic code than people who have expanded farther away. That's correct, right?
That's right. That's right. The greatest amount of genetic diversity we see in humans is on the continent of Africa and among populations that are descended from Africans. And basically, the genetic diversity gets lower as you move overland from Africa, sort of as people traveled out of Africa into the Middle East, into Europe, into Asia, and then from Asia into the Oceania, the oceanic islands,
Hmm.
Australia, and then across the Bering Strait and into North and South America. And so, yeah, that lower and lower genetic diversity reflects the spread of our ancestors across the globe.
Yeah, the human expansion out of Africa is just such an incredible story, especially when we know from fossil records like and water lines, just from the Bering Strait being exposed and people being able to walk over this land bridge. And the same thing, I don't think a lot of people know, is in Oceania and there's all those islands between mainland Asia and Australia. That was just all land right there, and you could just walk all the way across towards Australia. And you think about how.
Almost all the way.
Okay.
There's a few places where the water was always deep enough that there would have been some ocean crossings that were necessary. And there's actually some interesting scientific history there because Alfred Russel Wallace, who was Darwin's contemporary and co-discovered the theory of evolution by natural selection, he actually figured out that there must be deep water in a certain area, sort of between the island of Bali and the next adjacent island to the east, Lombok. Because even though the islands look pretty much similar, there's completely different types of animals. On Bali, you get more Asian fauna, and then on Lombok, you get more Australian type fauna. And he couldn't figure out why until he realized there are other islands nearby that share that same pattern. It's become known as Wallace's Line, and it actually reflects deep water in the region that would, even at very, very low sea levels, not have been a land bridge. But you're right that to the west of that would have been all connected to Southeast Asia.
That's amazing. I think, are you familiar with Graham Hancock? He's wouldn't be deemed as a pseudoscience, but he pushes the bounds from these potential historical new findings, like in Göbekli Tepe. I forgot the one in Indonesia or Southeast Asia. It might have been these civilizations that have been found. That date a little bit older than Mesopotamia. We're talking 11,600, either 12,800 or 11,600 years ago. The one in Turkey, they've actually found this whole entire city filled in and preserved, and it dates back 13,000 years. And you know, from the new meteorite records and asteroid records of massive impact during those times, finding whether it's the glass that they get from meteorites or asteroids, or the diamonds that come off those things, they say that when you see the massive sea level rise change in that time, and where would most cities, or if there were towns or some civilization, if they did exist, we're talking about a 400-mile, I think, drop in of the sea level that would have, if anybody was living on the coast, like most of civilization today is 80% lives on coastline, where would all that coastline have been if there were any older civilization, or if there were some remnants of, maybe not as advanced as us, but a little bit more advanced human species or human civilization than we see at Mesopotamia, around 8,000, 6,000 years ago. It's an interesting hypothesis. He's backed it up with, like I said, like you said, a lot of geologists. So it's interesting stuff. It's interesting to check out. It's interesting to see your take on that.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that, but there is a species of hominin, a human relative that is found east of Wallace's Line. This is the so-called hobbits, Homo
Oh,
floresiensis.
Floresians. Yeah, I've heard of these.
Exactly.
It's amazing.
And one of the things that's really intriguing about it is that so these are a species of our same genus, Homo, that somehow made it across Wallace's Line. In other words, they must have crossed that stretch of open ocean in order to reach the island of Lombok, where their fossils have been found. And as far as was thought, it wasn't expected that they would have had the technological ability to create boats to be able to cross open sea. So it's something of a mystery of how they made it across.
And we're talking hobbits. Like, how big and were these people, and like how many fossils have they found over there to say like this was like an actual subset of the
Mhm.
Homo species?
Yeah, there were about 3 feet tall, and there have been numerous individuals found, all from the same site. There's a cave called Liang Bua on the island of Flores, and yeah, enough individuals that it has satisfied most of the people who at first suspected that maybe this was just some sort of a weird individual that maybe had some sort of a genetic disease or something that made them smaller, made their head smaller. But no, in fact, there have been numerous individuals, I don't recall the exact number now, that have been found, but several individuals that all have those same combination of features, which include making them very short-statured, small heads, smaller brain cases compared to Homo sapiens. So it's a really fascinating and really peculiar discovery back in, I think the discovery was like around 2004.
And how old did they date some of these fossils? Like, when was like the last of them?
So that's something that has changed somewhat in recent years. The dating estimates for how recently these species existed. When the paper first came out describing the finding, they were being reported as being extremely recent, and I don't recall exactly what the date was, but I want to say it was something like like 30,000 years ago or something like that, that would have made them definitely overlapping with modern Homo sapiens in the same area. And the recent estimates, if I'm not mistaken, are pushing back on that earliest date. So there's still some possibility that they might have overlapped with Homo sapiens, perhaps leading to the suggestion that that's actually what caused them to go extinct. Right, when our species showed up, they might have wiped them out, as seems to have happened in a few other cases, including with um,
Neanderthals, mammoths, uh,
yeah,
Homo
we don't
florescens. We
we
don't like
don't
other
always
kind.
play nicely with others. Yeah.
Not even with
Um,
ourselves. We're a violent species.
Although we also now know from a lot of genetic studies that we also interbred with Neanderthals and Denisovans, other contemporary species that that we interacted with. So the thinking used to be, oh, we just conquered, wiped out, or outcompeted these other species that we interacted with. But it seems to be much more complex than that. We seem to, even though that's also still possible, we may have also we did also mate with some of these other species, and that led to children that were born and raised and reared as humans, because we all share some of the DNA of Neanderthals and Denisovans in our genomes today.
Hmm. No, it's I don't even know if that relates back to the human idea of hope or chance, that weird belief we have as a species that we can overcome anything, that we can do anything. And you think about love stories, and I don't care if this person comes from this family or that family. This is species, but like really, I mean, how much of a difference or how close are we saying, like on perception? Because these ancestors of ours, we're talking about 40, 50, or even 100,000, 200,000 years ago when we were with Neanderthals. How long ago are we talking?
Yeah, I think we're talking about more on the order of 50,000 to 100,000 years ago.
Okay.
So yeah, so our the first humans to leave the continent of Africa, first Homo sapiens, was around 70,000 years ago. So that's about when we expect a lot of that hybridization to have occurred.
Yeah. I don't know if I'm anthropomorphizing either, because these were our closest relatives, but were they even there saying, no, I love this person, I love this thing, it's not actually us, but it looks like us, like, can we get along with this thing, can I mate with it? And just like, was there a love story like we can like kind of put together for a movie or book nowadays?
I think it's a fascinating question, and one that I've wondered about as well. I've thought for a while it'd make a great subject for some historical fiction, right? Because it really does kind of capture the imagination. I mean, what you're talking about is actually questioning the definition of what it means to be human, and that's a profound question, isn't it? I mean, what we're saying is, you know, how wide a net can we cast when we talk about humans? And when I'm teaching human evolution, I have a slide that I show that kind of represents all of the different species of hominins that we know about. So different species within the genus Homo, and then also some of the earlier genera like Australopithecus, for example, Lucy's species.
Hmm.
And what you see when you look at how each of those fossil species sort of existed through time, what you see is that throughout most of our history, there were multiple species of human around at the same time, and in many cases in the same place. It's really only today that we have only one type of human around. I mean, this is the world that we're all familiar with, a world in which there is just one species of human, Homo sapiens. But that's the exception. That's not the rule. I mean, throughout history, there were all these other species, and it's also fascinating to think about. As you go backwards in time, if we could go back with a time machine and go back to the common ancestor we shared with chimpanzees between 5 and 7 million years ago, if we were able to look at that common ancestor today, it would have looked very much like a chimpanzee. It was not a chimpanzee, just to be clear. Chimpanzees changed as they evolved from that common ancestor, just as as change happened on our lineage. But it probably shared many characteristics with chimpanzees. It would have been, hunched over, walking on all fours, covered in hair, had facial and skull characteristics that look very chimpanzee-like. My point is that we would have considered it an animal.
Mm-hmm.
If there were zoos at the time, we would have, probably put them in zoos and been fascinated by watching their, interesting and unusual behaviors. But somehow, somewhere on that lineage from that common ancestor up to Homo sapiens, there was a change from what we would consider to be an animal to what we consider to be human. But it is very difficult to say where you can actually draw that line. Is it a fine line? Is it a gradual change? At what point did we become human? That's really the ultimate question that you're asking there
Mm-hmm.
is what is the meaning of being human, and what makes us, what about us makes us human and makes us not an animal?
What does science say about that? How would science define, what makes us human?
Well, I'm not sure that question, as we're thinking about it, is really a question that science can define, because
Mm-hmm.
that's why I think it's so ripe for someone who wants to explore this as a novel or something. I mean, I think from the scientific perspective, what we can do is look at how we define a species or a genus. We can look at genetic and physical differences among individuals. Our ability to look at genetic differences only exists for the recent species, because DNA doesn't preserve well over longer periods of time. So we can look at genetic differences between humans, Homo sapiens, and Neanderthals and Denisovans, for example, and then we can compare our genomes to those of chimpanzees, which are quite different. But ultimately, I'm not sure that really gives us a satisfying answer to the question of what is it that makes us human, right? This is the classic sort of reductionist argument. If we can find that, little bit of our genome that makes us different, does that really define what makes us human? Does it help us understand whether we would have, you know, uh, been able to be in love with an individual Neanderthal or Denisovan? I don't think it can. I think it's a type of question that really science isn't equipped to answer.
I love that. Gives much more to the imagination. Now, I know one of your focuses is evolution. Not just trying to make a guess, because I think that's very similar to like you said, with science making an answer. I know you were at a lecture or a talk, Richard Dawkins' talk, and he had mentioned something, or someone asked a great question. He's like, I can't really elaborate on that answer of what we eventually may look like, or how we'll look like. Because I think, like I said, we have a much greater magnifying glass on us as people nowadays. I talked to a carnivore medical doctor on the last episode, who's a big promoter of the carnivore diet. And he's a unreal athlete and human. He's like 6'5", 250 pounds. At 53, he's winning, breaking rowing records against Olympians. Like he's nuts. One in a million kind of guy. But we're able to look at, even like food and diets, like, oh, these are the dietary things you actually need every day. And, are we sure those are the things every day? So even though we have this magnifying glass on us as a human species, people want to see results right away. We kind of define things in results. So, I wouldn't say the question is, are we still evolving? But, if we are we evolving even faster? Are we evolving even quicker? And what are some of those, I would say, those variables that are, enhancing the evolution of the human species?
Yeah, so there's a lot there. So right,
Sorry.
so no, it's good, it's good. So yeah, you're alluding to the sort of the question that prompted me to write my book, Future Humans, several years ago now. And yeah, it did come from attending a Richard Dawkins talk. Richard Dawkins, famous evolutionary biologist, and he was asked in the Q&A if humans are still evolving, and if so, how. And his response was that he gets that question a lot, but he won't answer it because he thinks it would just be pure speculation. And that really intrigued me, because I thought, well, I'd like to kind of see what research there is out there looking at how humans are evolving today. And it turns out that there's quite a lot, and it's scattered across different disciplines, from anthropology to sociology to psychology to microbiology and others. But yes, the answer is clear that human evolution has continued up until modern times, never stopped. It's difficult to say if the rate of evolutionary change is different from what it's been historically. It sort of depends on what time period you want to compare it to. One thing that does seem to be happening today is, although natural selection is still clearly operating, we know that that is the case, the way that natural selection operates today is changed dramatically because of culture, because of technology, because of our societies. It's no longer the case that your chances of survival and reproduction are due mostly to the genes that you happen to inherit from your parents. That is a factor, but it's a much smaller factor for most people in the world today than it would have
First time in
been
history,
10,000
we
years
would say,
ago.
right?
Right, right,
It's
because we have so
amazing.
much control. So yeah, things like infectious disease have been a major part of our evolution in the past. And I have a whole chapter on this in Future Humans, and the big impact that infectious diseases have had. Diseases like malaria have left a big impact on our bodies and our genomes. Um, and what we're seeing is that that can still be the case today, although the extent to which infectious diseases, at least up until this year, have affected us is less than they would have been historically. But the rest of the answer, which we can get into if you want, is natural selection is only one of the ways that evolution works. And so one of the things I try to do in that book is to look at the many other ways that people are often less familiar with that evolution can take place. And they have to do with things like sexual selection. How we choose our romantic partners influences our evolution. The evolution of the microbes that live in and on our bodies, the microbiome, and many other factors like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's not we probably are the only species who can, who doesn't look at the, the physical nature of, of a sexual mate and say, oh, these are the biggest, strongest genes I need to replicate or multiply. I think on like the evolution, the subconscious level that happens, whether it's the shape of a woman or the size of a man, like in their appearance, those factors are still there that people, subconsciously don't don't obviously they can't see or can't feel or understand. But the interesting one, like, is just as a young guy who's still dating, it's just like how, looking back, how people did it. And you even look at animals, where monogamy usually doesn't exist or isn't a factor at all. It's either trying to duplicate or multiply your genes the most you possibly can in order to pass on that dominance of your cells. But it's more, even still, like the cells on a subconscious level are the things dictating the results. We need you to consume as much resources so you can continue to duplicate our cells in other animals. It's fascinating to think about. Just on a base level, like, that's all it is: consume
Well,
resources and
and that ties back. We were just talking about Richard Dawkins. I mean, one of the books that he became famous for early in his career is a book called The Selfish Gene,
I've read it.
which makes exactly that argument. Yep, that basically, the genes are the factors that are most important to understand when it comes to evolution, and that he argues this, we are essentially vehicles for those genes to be able to be replicated. That's an interesting argument.
No, it is, because I mean, socially and culturally, like, we've, you know, I'll still call it an experiment, but we've done such an interesting job of, what do you want to say? It's religion or society and culture. Like, hey, this thing called monogamy is going to be the thing that's going to tie and make a big group of us together, make this thing called civilization. We're going to kind of push in a positive direction. And it's worked for the most part in terms of, in the improvement of civilization or the improvement of people's health, well-being, and prosperity on, a very wide scale. It's been good. we've made it happen. Again, this is the first time in this 8,000-year experiment of civilization. So it's going to be interesting to see how it goes, because I think there's a lot of, like you said, a lot of evolution, a lot of things that can affect our evolution as a species, you know, with monogamy, with isolation, with the kind of work that we're doing, and throwing in just different technologies from social media, that are going to affect us. We're just even looking at it as in generations now. The differences between people from the baby boomers to the Gen Xers to the millennials to the Gen Zers, like we're literally making like cutoff points of like every 20 years and seeing very, very, very big differences in people. Or, I mean, I wouldn't say those are evolutionary. Are we looking at like things evolutionary there, or are we just looking at like differences between humans of that? Or could that potentially be something that we say, whoa, there's a difference in people?
I think we're looking at cultural differences there, and that is part of what makes it difficult for us to make very specific predictions about our evolution moving forward, because culture does play a role in our evolution. And just to think about that, I mean, think about the way that culture affects the two most important ingredients in evolution, which are survival and reproduction. Culture influences both of those substantially, and the fact that there can be generational differences in behavior, in the things that people do, how they date, as an example, right? That's something that people are really interested in looking at, sort of generational differences in how we communicate. Lots of differences that we can look at that are fascinating. The fact that those differences exist suggests that the ways in which culture is rapidly changing could have an influence on our evolution moving forward. But it changes so fast that it makes it hard to predict the specifics of how we will evolve moving forward, because what you really need to make predictions about our evolutionary future is to have the same kinds of factors in play for a long enough period of time that each generation responds to them in similar ways.
Yeah, and that's not happening. I mean, we have the internet. If you're going to say one big, big, massive thing that could, you know, affect us as a planet. Because you think about the amount of people that have access. We're at like half the population of the world, about 4 billion people, either have a cell phone or access to the internet. Which we want to say on something that could affect, the same species on the same planet. That there's one factor right there. So it's going to be nuts because, like you said, not many things have been continuous to make a prediction on the evolution of the species. Interesting right there. And the contrary, what historical trends have happened over the past, a few thousand years, or tens of thousands of years, that are likely to continue, that could affect our evolution?
Well, I think one of the biggest ones is just the size of our global population, right? So that's one of the things that's really been notable over the last several thousand years, and especially over the last few hundred years, that our population has grown exponentially.
Insane. Even the past
It
100, like
is.
you said, it's gone up 7 billion just from 1900.
That's right. And so that has a really, really big implications for evolution for a number of reasons. We already talked about how having so many people makes us a bigger target for infectious diseases, and those infectious diseases are going to continue to affect our evolution. But the other thing is that with the birth of each new baby, there are new versions of our genomes that probably never existed before that now exist. And each new mutation, each new version of a gene is a new opportunity. It's a new possibility for some trait that perhaps never existed before that might be beneficial in the world that we live in today. And having so many new babies born each year because of our enormous population size means that there's more potential for evolutionary change today than there ever has been before in our history. And so I think that having a large population size, whether it's 8 billion, 10 billion, or even if ends up becoming a little bit smaller, we go back to 5 million, um, billion, excuse me, 5 billion, not 5 million.
There'd be a
I
lot of
think
dead
that's very
bodies.
unlikely. No, but if we have, a human population that numbers in the billions, I think that is going to have an enormous influence on our evolution moving forward, um, and, for the reasons that I just described. And that's something that I think has been one of the biggest factors of the recent past.
I don't even think I know this answer, but if you could, I mean, I think a difference explanation of the differences would be great. What is a mutation, and is a mutation the same as an evolution, or if they're different, what's the differences?
Yeah, good question, and thanks for asking that, so I can clarify. So, a mutation is just any difference that happens in the DNA that makes up our genome. So remember that DNA is just a four-letter alphabet. You have A, T, G, and C, which are these chemical bases that basically create a code that tells the body how to make proteins. And proteins are the things that do most of the work in the body. And this is not just the human body and all
Mm,
life as we know it. And so anytime one of those DNA letters changes, you can have an A that changes to a T or a C to a G. Any change in one or more of those bases is what we call a mutation. And this happens all the time. And it happens because when cells divide, they have to copy all of their internal components in order to go from one cell to two cells. And that includes making copies of the DNA. And that is a process that, like any time you've tried to copy something, it's not perfect, right? So anytime you make a copy of the entire genome, there's a chance that there will be an error in copying the DNA code. And that's what a mutation is. And so every time cells divide, there's an opportunity for a mutation. There's a chance that there's going to be a mutation. Most of those mutations are going to be bad, right? I mean, you've got this intricate genetic code that tells the body how to make, all of the things to make a human body. If you go and you change one, it's probably going to end up being a change for the worse. But every now and then, those changes can be something that actually is I don't, an improvement, I guess you could say, or something that's helpful under the current circumstances. And those mutations are the origin of all of the diversity of life on Earth. Um, Now, you asked whether that is the same as evolution. So, evolution is defined as a change in how common different things are in a population from one generation to the next. So we can look at it at the genetic level. We can say how common is a certain mutation, right? So if we wanted to look at the genes that allow you to roll your tongue, for example, right? So if you can roll your tongue, and do that with your tongue, that's a genetically controlled trait. Some people can do it, some people can't. I like that trait because I don't think hopefully it doesn't offend anybody, right? It doesn't make a difference if you can roll your tongue or not, as far as I'm aware. So, so basically, we can look at how, in one generation, we can look at what is the percentage of people that can roll their tongue. And then we can look at the next generation. And if the percentage is different, then there's been evolution. That is actually the definition of evolutionary change. Now, we haven't said why is the percentage different, right? So for a trait like rolling your tongue, we're assuming that natural selection has nothing to do with it, because rolling your tongue, again, as far as I know, doesn't have anything to do with survival or reproduction. But if it was a trait that does matter for survival, right? So, classic example are the Galapagos finches that have beaks of different shapes, and those that have bigger beaks that are capable of applying more force are sometimes better at cracking open seeds. And that could be an advantage in a year where there was a drought that meant there aren't that many seeds around. So in that case, deeper, thicker beaks are going to become more common in the next generation because there was an advantage to the individuals that had them, and they were more likely to survive and pass on their genes. So the mutation itself, in a way, isn't really evolution, although it can lead to evolution in that it can create an advantage, or it can be a disadvantage, in which case it's going to become less common. So
Mm.
just a trait that is more common or less common over time, and time here being defined as generation time is the definition of evolution.
Yeah, so mutations could even be cancer, because cancer is just one cell making, or an abundance of one cell that's the body can't use or process or even combat. So I mean that could technically cause a mutation in one of your cells, that all of a sudden you're just creating way too many white blood cells, and there's a complete imbalance. And I think too much white blood cells, that'd be leukemia, if I'm not mistaken. And that again, that could just be a mutation of one cell, breaking off because of some either internal or external thing that could contribute to that
Yeah.
happening.
So actually, you're absolutely right. So we actually think about cancer, we can think about cancer as being an evolutionary process that plays out within a body. And so, yeah, I mean, cancer happens when cells that normally don't just keep dividing, right? The normal cells in our body have internal checks that tell them when they're supposed to divide and make new cells and when they're not. But cancer happens when those cells lose their check. So it could be a mutation. It oftentimes is a mutation that happens for one reason or another that causes the cell to lose its ability to stop replicating. And the cells that replicate more are, of course, going to be more common. And so that mutation is advantageous from the point of view of the cell has now left a lot more copies of that mutation in the body. But of course, it can ultimately be detrimental in that, unconstrained cell growth can obviously cause health problems for the whole body. So it's actually sort of an important lesson there, because what it shows is that evolution can't sort of look into the future and sort of be acting with a particular goal in mind. It just happens, and sometimes it leads down a path that is beneficial, and sometimes it leads down a path that ultimately is a dead end.
I think you mentioned also in the book that mutation rates occur higher in mammals. Is How and why is that so?
Well, actually, every species has its own rate of mutations, and that's because every organism controls its the copying of its DNA in slightly different ways. So the cells actually have a proofreading roles. So there in copying DNA, there's a proofreading step in which the cells try to minimize the chances of a mutation happening, because, as I said, most of the time it's harmful. But each species has its own sort of built-in checks and proofreading abilities, and so you see variation across all different species. I'm not sure it's true that mammals necessarily have a higher rate of mutation than other animals. It really varies a lot. Viruses tend to have a very rapid rate of mutation, and that's one of the reasons
Excuse me.
why they're so difficult for us to deal with, because they're always changing. It's a moving target.
And viruses are single celled, right? Or they're multi-celled?
Actually, they don't have cells at all. So viruses are weird, and that's part of why I was saying earlier, biologists sort of can't really even agree on whether we should consider them living things, because not only do they require a cell to replicate, they don't even have cells.
Yeah, they need the
They
host.
have,
Yeah.
yeah, they have a some sort of sort of an outer coating or membrane or capsid that sort of encases the DNA or RNA. It can be a genome that is made of RNA, as is the case for the coronavirus that causes COVID-19. It's an RNA genome. Um, and really that's all they have, is that protein coat and the genome. They don't have all of the other complex things that our cells have. So it's a if it is a living thing, it's a non-cellular. The only other type of life that that isn't cell based.
Unreal. What's the other one?
Well, no, only viruses. So
Only
all
virus.
life that we know of has cells, and then there are viruses, but their viruses are incredibly diverse. We're still discovering new types of viruses, including some that are much smaller than we thought could have existed, and also some that are much larger than we thought could have existed. And interestingly, there is no form of life that we know of that is not infected by some viruses. So viruses affect all forms of life, and we don't even really know how viruses came into existence. So there's a debate about whether, for example, all viruses share a common ancestor, or whether different types of viruses came into existence independently. We really don't know the answer to that yet.
I've never thought about that because I mean we can date back bacteria. I mean even mitochondria is a bacteria that has evolved into our own cells to be the energy blocks of every little cell in our body. So I never even thought about that. Wow. So we have no idea where viruses or come from.
Yeah, there's, like I said, there's competing theories, and those are essentially the two sort of camps, right? Either all viruses sort of shared a common ancestor. There was a sort of ancestral virus, and then it diversified into the many types of viruses that we see today. Or the virus lifestyle, if you will, might be something that could have evolved multiple times independently. And each of these different types, very different types of viruses. I mean, RNA viruses, DNA viruses are very different from one another. There's a lot of diversity within viruses. And I mean, the world is filled with viruses.
That's
It's a
crazy.
scary thing to think about now, but
Very.
yeah,
you
yeah.
you
Most of them
open.
don't affect us, you know?
Well, I mean, I think I got to take it back to COVID-19 because I know that's one of the big conspiracies, or there. I don't even know if this is a conspiracy, but a lot of people say that people are man making these viruses. I guess smallpox is a virus, and we can like make man made ones in labs. I know that was a big problem in Russia when the Soviet Union fell. Like, hey, we have all these different strains of these viruses in these chemical labs. So, is it that easy to say that we can just start creating viruses the way some people are alluding to in some of these bio weapon warehouses or labs that exist or don't exist around the world?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of confusion around this, like you said, right? And I think one of the things to understand is that people can't just create a virus from scratch, right? The concern is that maybe somebody took an existing virus and modified it in some way, but there's no evidence to suggest that that is what happened in the case of the coronavirus that causes COVID-19. I haven't done these analyses myself, but I've seen some of the analyses that have been done by others. And you can really clearly see when you compare the RNA sequence of the genome of the COVID-19 coronavirus and compare it with other coronaviruses, you can see each of those mutations that has happened even within the coronavirus that has been infecting humans. I mean, one of the things that's fascinating that we have the ability to do now is to trace the infection um, between different human populations based on those mutations that have happened in the RNA genome of this virus. And you can clearly trace it back to a single origin in China. And then you can see that it is very closely related to strains of coronavirus that infect wild animals. And so the original suggestion that it was a host switch that happened I guess in the wet market in Wuhan, China, as far as I am aware, is well supported by the scientific data that comes from comparing the genomes of these of the different strains of the virus. So that's very consistent, like I said, with what we know happens from time to time with these viruses just shifting hosts from one species to us. And
Mhm.
that seems quite clearly to be what happened here.
Yeah. No, because I mean, it was interesting once we started going off on, that viruses like are like a unique strain of, species on this planet itself. But if someone were to go tinker that in a lab, like they could, change like you said, does it have genetic makeup, a virus? Or like if
Yeah,
someone you
that's
said
the
wanted to
RNA
tink,
genome.
they could take the
Mhm.
RNA, or is RNA and DNA ones, there's different kind, correct?
There are DNA viruses and there are RNA viruses. Yeah.
So someone could tinker it to, but I could somebody in a lab like actually program it to say, hey, I want you to attack, you know, let's you have let's play into people's conspiracies for a second. I want to make it a high attacking respiratory pneumonia type illness, or can someone really go in and I know what we've done with CRISPR and be able to actually deconstruct genetic codes. Can people actually do that?
The thing is that we really don't understand enough about how these genomes work to even know what changes to make if somebody wanted to make that particular type of change. I
Hmm.
mean, you could turn it around and say, okay, if we had that ability, why don't we now go in and reverse engineer it to make it less deadly, right? To make it less harmful. If we had the ability to do that, you can imagine there'd be people out there trying to do that right now, right?
Hmm.
The problem is that we don't know enough about how the genome of this virus works to know exactly what buttons to press, so to speak, right? Which A's, T's, G's, and C's do you need to tinker with to get exactly the desired outcome in making it more or less pathogenic, more or less virulent, more or less deadly. Um, the, the reality is for most species, including our own, we still don't know how genomes work in enough detail to be able to go in and make those types of changes. I mean, Homo sapiens is the species we know the most about in every level, including genetically. And we don't know enough still to be able to make those types of changes in our own genomes with any confidence. So,
Mm.
um, this is a virus we've only known about for, not even half a year now. We certainly don't know enough about how to make those types of changes. Now, it doesn't mean that we won't ever know. And so I think it is important for people to, um, you know, uh, um, develop the ethical guidelines for the use of the technology that you were talking about, the CRISPR-Cas9 gene editing technology. We need um, to have more work on what types of genetic changes are acceptable and what are not acceptable, because there will come a day when we do have enough knowledge about how these genomes work in order to make the types of changes that you're talking about. But the reality is that we're not there yet.
Yeah, I know in China they've really started pushing the envelope on experimentations with CRISPR and what you know what they can do. Because I know I think in the U.S. it's still it's pretty expensive, but we're talking about changing the eye color or changing the hair color, or picking those things out in your future baby. I mean, that's all technology we have these days. But I mean, I'm sure that's not as advanced of something to study and look at to say how do we change the genetic makeup of an entire species, or a virus, which we're not sure what is, um, to recreate that. But I mean, well, it's tough to get information out of China, I guess, these days on what's actually happening, going on, not just with COVID, but even their research with CRISPR, and because I know it's like a wild, wild west of what you can experiment on in people, or what even people think is happening over there with whether it's what are some of the crazy things that come out of there, the organ markets, or you know who knows. But what am I going to in terms of CRISPR, how far are we along with that in terms of what we can change on the genetic code of humans?
Well, I mean, the CRISPR technology that we have today does allow us to go in and make essentially any change that you would like. You can make very precise, deliberate changes to the genome of any organism with CRISPR, and this is being done routinely in labs around the world now. And that's not controversial. What is controversial is the idea of making a genetic change in a human cell that would develop into a human baby that would result in a birth, right? That is, of course, something that we we need to be much, much more careful about before that becomes something that is acceptable. So the technology isn't really the limiting factor right now. The limiting factor is really our knowledge of the genome, and and knowing which changes would be beneficial, and being confident that those changes that we think are beneficial would also be safe, right? So you want to be able to, like any treatment, you want it to be both safe and effective. So I'll give you an example. Sickle-cell disease, right, is a disease of the red blood cells that causes the red blood cells to have the crescent or sickle shape. And it's caused by and it can be a deadly disease. And it's caused by a single mutation, a single DNA base. One of those A's becomes a T, or I forget what the actual change is, but it's just a single DNA base. And so because we know that, in theory, it is possible to go in with CRISPR and change it back to what it would normally be in a normal red blood cell. The question is, can we do that safely? In other words, if you make that change, are we certain that there won't be any other changes to other genes? Are we certain that that gene isn't going to interact with any other genes in ways that could be harmful? So those are the types of things that we need to be certain of before we can really consider using CRISPR, widely in humans. And that's an example of a gene that we know well. Like we understand the genetics of sickle cell very well. Most human traits that we're interested in, especially when you get into, I mean, you talked about eye color, hair color, something like that. It gets much more complicated. The genetics of those traits are relatively well understood in most cases. It gets much more complicated when you get into something like height, right? You want your child to be tall or a particular height.
I
Could we do
want a
that
basketball playing
genetically?
children, I don't
There
want
you
them to
go.
be 5'11" basketball players. I want them to be 6'5", 6'6".
The next center for the Lakers, right? I mean, so,
Exactly.
but if that's what you want, well, it turns out that there are probably thousands of individual genes that each plays a small role in determining an individual's height. So it's not just going in and making one change. It would be making exactly the right change to all of those genes. And we need to know which change to make. And we need to know that each of those changes isn't going to have any other effect. And then it gets even more complicated because, as you
Whoa.
probably know, height is also something that is based on your environment, right? If you aren't fed well as a child, that can affect your height. If you, do a lot of
Sleep.
weightlifting, when,
Yeah.
yeah, there's so many factors in your life when you're at certain critical ages that can affect your height. So that's actually a great example, because most traits that we are interested in are like that. They have a lot of genes that are involved in affecting the trait, and there's an environmental component in the trait. So it's not so easy to just say, oh, we'll just go in and make this little tweak in the genome and we'll get this desired outcome. It's way more complicated than that. And so that it's not the technology right now that's limiting us in being able to edit the human genome in particular ways. It's our knowledge of the genome and how those genes affect each of the traits that we're interested in.
Yeah. So you hear that, people? It's better to enhance your child outside the womb when they're being children or they're growing up. It's still the best way to nurture or enhance their height. I mean, we have human growth hormone now. I think even steroids are taking in the proper form. I mean, can positively contribute to somebody, but that's not a child. We're talking an adult. Would want to use on the incredible amounts of performance enhancing substances they've created over the past, I'd say 50, 60 years. And the experimentation they've done on people to know what works and what doesn't work. I think, I think it's like what is it? Testosterone's such a massively used one, to manipulate our endocrine system, especially in men. And then you have human growth hormone, even for children, the fact that we can manipulate our pituitary glands to just start kicking in the evening and sending out human growth hormone to the body to help enhance growth. I mean,
Yeah, and the thing is that all of those things that you're talking about are things that we can do to ourselves as an individual that will have some effect on us. But the thing about genetic changes that's even more concerning is that those changes could become heritable, right? So if we change the DNA of your child, it's not just your child that is affected; it's your child's child, your child's grandchildren. And so that's where the ethical considerations become even more complicated, because you're talking about changes to future generations. And so it gets even more complex than just thinking about an individual's ability to make a change for themselves.
Yeah. So we got a long way to go with CRISPR. Now that I'm looking at it in terms of like it takes thousands of switches to, part of the code in order to, especially when we're talking about height or something. Now it says you are a science communicator, you teach science communication. What does that entail?
Well, I mean, my own science communication ability, experiences are basically, you talked about my book. I try to do a lot of public speaking and try to write about science for the public. And I personally do that because, in part, because I enjoy it, and in part because I feel like it's important for the public to hear from scientists about science. I sort of see my job in my career as sharing my knowledge and passion of science with others, whether it's students in the classroom or for the general public. But because I think it's so important, I also try to help to train other people to be able to communicate their science. And so that's taken different forms over the years. So for many years, I taught a course that is required for our biology majors at Rice, which is a course on science communication, both technical communication, scientists writing for other scientists, but also scientists communicating to the public. But most recently, I've been co-teaching a seminar course where what we do is we try to bring in guest speakers who communicate science in different ways. So sometimes that's science journalists, sometimes it's museum curators. We've had scientific illustrators, documentary filmmakers, photographers, all different sorts of people that are communicating science in one way or another to the public. And it's really just a way to kind of expose our students to the many different forms that science communication takes, and also just kind of emphasizing the importance of it. I think, we ask each of our guest speakers to talk about why they do what they do, and what they found to be effective, and what the challenges are that they face. So that's a lot of fun.
How is that going? How is presenting your message to the public right now going? I'd see a lot of people don't trust experts these days, or they don't want to take on um, the information being passed down to over people from universities, or if they're on television, or if they're giving lectures. What's been your experience? Let's say, I'll call it
Yeah.
in the past 4 or 5 years.
Yeah, so I actually, I have not personally experienced that much of that. It's really it's interesting. I get a lot of inquiries about coming and giving a talk at a museum or a church or to a book club or something like that. And in my experience, the number of those inquiries has just increased over time. So just from my own perspective, I haven't seen that kind of a rise in skepticism or reluctance to hear from scientists. I find that people are eager to learn, eager to ask questions, eager to have conversations about interesting questions, big picture topics. I love giving these types of talks and having these kinds of conversations like what we're having now, because it's so different from the normal conversations that we tend to have in society, right? I think it's really fun to be able to kind of ask the big questions, ask the hard questions, like some of the questions that we've just been talking about. And there just aren't always a lot of opportunities to have those conversations, and personally I find them to be fascinating and important.
It's the main reason why I got into this. I couldn't play basketball anymore, and okay, I kind of didn't do a good job in university, studying anything. I was a history major. I love history. I'm a savant when it comes to dates, times, whys, understanding people, but where's a career in that? So, I get to, now have conversations with people I'm just very fascinated with, who have a better understanding of the things I want to learn about, and I think my audience wants to learn about. So that's where we've seen, this new explosion into, or a second golden age of radio via podcasting. We took TiVo and we said, okay, what's the best thing about TiVo? You can turn it on and off and pause it whenever you want. So with a podcast, we're going to take that into radio. And we're going to create a podcast with that. And, who knew that was the thing that people craved or were really looking for? Because it's a technology that already existed. But no,
I think it's
go ahead.
I was saying, I think it's great, and I think now, as a lot of people are at home and trying to find ways to entertain themselves, to learn something new, to explore new topics and ideas. I would predict that there's going to be sort of a doubling down on that explosion in podcasts as people discover new podcasts and find that they have lots of different ways to learn interesting things.
Yeah. I mean, what I tell people, it's like, when they're interested in starting a show, because I host a service to help people launch shows, create shows, market it, distribute it. And, I try to explain to them, it's not necessarily making money on the show itself. It's the accessibility you have to an individual now, because I'm sure you listen to podcasts, but, you're not listening to podcasts just in the car, when you're washing the dishes, when you're going to the bathroom, where you're in your bed. You have an audience's attention whenever they feel like it, which is so unique. So they're already turning on to you because they like what you have to say, or who you're going to talk to, and you're getting them in unique, intimate atmospheres of their attention. So it's very, very, very unique. However, going back into like you said, getting pushback from people, whether they like your stuff or don't like your stuff, is they can be very selective on what they want to hear. They don't like what you have to say. I'm going to go over here to find someone say the things that are comfortable with my experience or reality. So, that was the question I had, because I've seen a lot of, medical professionals, the Bill Gates, get the most pushback right now, because, people don't want to shut their economy. We don't want to shut our economy down. They, I think, your experience of work, it's kind of sad. People are like, oh, I need to be working. I have to be working, because you've got to keep your family afloat, not just because, situations aren't great for people in lower middle classes in our country, but, they're very readily pushing back on, experts or people who have experience in these said fields. So that's kind of like why I took the conversation there, to see if you were having those same experiences. I think it's really interesting that, hey, I use an Android phone, and there's probably some spin-off of Bill Gates and Bill Gates' technology creating Microsoft and Windows, and which has led to, improvement in cell phone technology. But I don't want him creating my vaccine. I don't want him creating my medicine. I like some of his stuff here, and I'm going to use his technology to say why I don't like him. It's just, biting the hand that feeds you kind of thing. It's weird.
Yeah, I think it's going to be interesting to see whether there's going to be a change in perceptions of vaccines moving forward, right? Because that's one specific example of science skepticism you were asking about, which I guess it depends on sort of how a vaccine for COVID-19 plays out. But eventually, it's quite likely that we're going to have one, and when that happens, if the pandemic hasn't already started to die down, that's likely to contribute to a big shift. And so I just wonder whether that is going to change people's perceptions and attitudes of the importance and safety of vaccines.
Doesn't look like it. Doesn't look like it from the people. I have one of my former guests on the show. He does news and politics from his house, and he's got like 1 million person following. But he's not on vaccines. You see the polls that he's taking online. Would you get a vaccine? And we're talking about hundreds of thousands of followers on a page, and 88% saying no. Maybe not 100,000 people are taking that poll, but that's a good taste of that individual's audience. And like I had someone from the head of public health, epidemiology, and communicable disease 2 podcasts ago from Washington State, and she was explaining how this is, and how Dr. Fauci's explained that this is a virus that's going to need a vaccine in order for us to, put it down or keep it at bay, and then continuous to make improvements on the vaccine, as this virus continues to mutate over, every season. It's not something that's just going to stop and go away as we see the second, third legs and third waves of the virus happening in these places. I've been following closely, and you'll see numbers go down, but then they jump up to 2,000 deaths again in a day, which I think we're going to have today. So, it comes down to, the agreement of civilization, like, how do we get people to understand that? And I think that's the hardest job you have. And I think a lot of people have, is explaining, that, this is one that we're going to need to just keep us afloat, to keep it from dying.
Well, yeah, I understand that, that people are generally trying to act in ways that keep themselves and their loved ones safe. So I understand that when people are skeptical of vaccines, that it's out of concern for their own safety and that of their families. What I suspect is going to happen, though, is if and when we get a vaccine for COVID-19, that people are going to start to see how quickly that flattens the curve, how quickly that changes the spread of the pandemic, and that will perhaps cause some people to consider whether they might change their opinions about vaccines, or certainly about this particular vaccine. That's also, though, one of the reasons why it's really important that people don't rush through the vaccine development process too quickly without going through all of the necessary safety checks, because one of the worst things we could do right now is
I know exactly where you're going.
rush to develop a vaccine that either isn't effective or isn't safe, or both. And then, of course, you can imagine that would further support people who are already skeptical of vaccines. So, we need to make sure, even though it's going to take time to do it, we need to make sure that when we do have a vaccine, that it's both safe and effective.
Well, that's an interesting place I want to take it to then, because a lot of people who are anti-vaxxers will say that the vaccine, or a vaccine that they've taken, I don't know if it's a vaccine for a certain disease, but they say that specific vaccine has triggered onsets of what is one of those personality disorders. You have Tourette's, you have autism. Autism seems to be one of the things that a lot of people who are skeptical or anti-vaxxers say that this thing triggers either onset autism, or it gets their children immediately into autism. And I know autism is still a very, very, very controversial thing, because we've seen like massive spikes in it in our children. I think it's like 1 in 1,000 now, but we don't know exactly what is I can't give the term. Not creating it, but making it happen.
Right.
Can't think of the exact exciting scientific verb I want to use there. So is there any scientific proof, or what is it about these vaccines and autism that people are seeing a correlation to, or believe that there's a correlation?
Yeah, unfortunately, that particular association is something that goes back to a study that was published some years ago that has actually been retracted and shown to have been false. And so the short answer is there is no scientific basis at all for an association between vaccines and autism. Now, what some people might be correlating is the timing of when children tend to get a lot of their vaccines, and the timing of when autism tends to start to become apparent, the symptoms of autism. Those do coincide. And so it makes sense that people would start to think that those two things are related, because you tend to get a lot of those childhood vaccines around the same time that symptoms of autism start to develop. But it's interesting, because I know that there's some research now that is able to look at some of the underlying aspects of what happens in autism even before the symptoms start to play out. And the evidence for those risk factors is actually apparent even before those children get those vaccines. In other words, you can see that that child is going to develop autism in some cases, even before the symptoms appear. And those warning signs are there um, before those children actually receive the immunizations that some people are claiming are associated with autism. So there really is not any scientific evidence. There's actually a book that I recommend that's written by one of my colleagues here at Rice, Dr. Peter Hotez, who's been one of the very outspoken advocates for the safety and importance of vaccines.
That name sounds very familiar. I think I've heard or seen a lecture or
Yeah,
talk from this gentleman.
he's actually one of our regular speakers in the science communication seminar series that I was just talking about. So he's come, um, every year for the last several years to talk about how to communicate about science to the public. And he does a lot of his communication on vaccines. And it just so happens that he has a daughter who has autism. And so his most recent book is his daughter's name is Rachel. His book is called Vaccines Did Not Cause Rachel's Autism, and it tackles that topic head on.
Hmm.
It talks about the science behind vaccines and vaccine development, including some of the work that he's done. And it also talks about his daughter and her, particular situation. And so he's sort of in a unique position to be able to talk about this exact issue because he is both a vaccine scientist and the father of a daughter with autism. So that's a great place to go to, and might even try reaching out to Dr. Hotez to see if he'd, maybe be interested in being a guest on your show.
I would love that. I think education is the biggest factor, and I think people, you know, we all live privileged lives. I think here in the U.S. So the fact that we live very, for the most of us, safe and sheltered lives. When something bad happens, and we have no specific reason or place to blame something, we love blaming things. Once we know we have something, we'll burn people if we can. It's like, but when we can't, and especially on the scientific realm where we're making so much change and so many discoveries, like we don't have something to explain it. And I think that's why you have such a unique position, and it already sounds like I mean, you're already come off with a very compassionate tone and compassionate manner, from trying to reach people, especially one with like anti-vax vaccines. Let's see. Where do I take this? Yes, the future. I know another big part of your thing. We talked about this last time. It's like and one of the topics of your book in the later chapters is going into space. Taking the human species to Mars or the moon, and whether it's be colonizing these what do you call it, planets, moons, whatever they are. And especially now we have this pandemic going on, and I know we talked about last time is if a baby were to be born on a colony on, let's say, Mars, it would be a complete different human in terms of species wise. Is that correct, or am I off there?
Well, I think that what could happen is over generations that you
Okay.
could get evolutionary changes that would ultimately make the descendants of people who colonized another planet different enough that we would consider them to be a distinct species. Yeah. And it's basically because that's a pattern that has played out on Earth thousands of times before. Every time there's an island that is formed and a new and life makes its way out there, plants, animals, insects, whatever it is, um, being isolated on an island with usually conditions that are different from the place that those organisms came from, that triggers rapid evolutionary change. And that is one of the reasons why evolutionary biologists going back to Darwin have looked to islands as places to study evolution, because islands are hotspots for evolutionary change. So I think the same factors would play out for humans living on on a colony on Mars or the moon or elsewhere in the solar system,
Well, I
because
think like
really, yeah. I was just gonna say, I mean, these planets are like in our solar system are like islands in the sea, just on a
yeah.
much bigger scale.
Well, I think like we mentioned too, I mean, even if we're going to be traveling from place to place, and we have to make sure that there's a certain amount of radiation that the sun's going to give off. Once we leave that atmosphere, that those ultraviolet rays are going to be hitting, whether it's going to be the colony there, or the lack of sunlight, or how are you getting light or natural light. You have to create like little bubble atmospheres for you to go out and play in on these planets and on these worlds. And how is the gravity going to change? Or we have gravity control areas that either muscle usage goes down or goes up. um, so yeah, I mean that could easily change over generations, and I mean I think it would change it over a massive way compared to we've moved across the planet, and evolution has changed. So
Yeah, I mean, what we know is that anytime an organism is moved to an environment that is different, it triggers rapid evolutionary change. But part of the reason I think this will happen faster on other planets like Mars is that radiation, as you mentioned, radiation is going to be one of the big challenges. Um, Mars, as an example, has a very thin atmosphere and has no magnetosphere. Those are the two things that protect us here on Earth from radiation in space. And because Mars doesn't have those, radiation hits its surface at almost full strength. And that causes mutations to happen much more rapidly than they would normally here on Earth. So not only do you have different physical conditions, but you also have more rapid mutations, and you combine those two things and that gives you a much more rapid rate of evolutionary change.
now, would we be able to bring, if we're saying we're traveling from place to place, and let's say the species has changed and we see enough evolution between, maybe it's 100 years, maybe it's 500 years in the future, and we have a colony, let's say, would the travel lines, like planes, how the travel lines we have in the world now are such great carriers for disease, will we be able to take disease from planet to planet or space to space like that? And I mean, would it be either as deadly or even more deadlier if we did that?
I think it's a really fascinating question. I mean, on the one hand, we'll take whatever is present in the bodies of the people that travel from one world to another, right? So when astronauts go to from Earth to the International Space Station, if they happen to have a virus or another infectious disease when they go, they take it with them, and the same would be true of people that go to create a colony on Mars or elsewhere. The difference, though, is that if we have a colony of people living on Mars, and if we're imagining a future scenario where there's multiple generations that have lived on Mars, so babies are born there, and people are living out their entire lives on Mars, there are not opportunities for new infectious diseases to arise on Mars in the same way that there are here on Earth. So as we were talking about before, all of these, about 60% of our infectious diseases on here on Earth come from diseases that once infected a bird or a mammal. So assuming that we don't bring birds and mammals with us to Mars, which would probably be a wise thing to do, there won't be those same opportunities for new infectious diseases on Mars or wherever we create those colonies. So that means there's less opportunity for new infectious diseases there.
So it'd be a hybrid, safer world. But what happens if we were somehow able to transport a cow or chicken to Mars? Obviously the potential for a virus to spread, or live inside one of these things that get transported over. The more and more I talk about it, I just think about the plot of the movie Alien. Because that was just like a whole organism, not just a virus, like a whole organism that jumped from person to person inside this spaceship. So I guess that's how it would go down.
Right, exactly. Well, but the other thing to think about is that I was saying how we would be evolving more rapidly in that environment, but so would the microbes that are causing these infectious diseases. So that's another thing to think about, is that whatever whatever microorganisms we bring with us, whether it's viruses, bacteria, protists, they too will be subject to the same higher radiation and new physical environment. And so they too will evolve more rapidly. So one of the concerns is that although we shouldn't
Jeez.
be seeing, yeah, exactly. So, that's something that we need to be thinking about as we start to develop plans for creating colonies off Earth, is
Yeah.
making sure that we're monitoring not only changes in our own bodies, but in changes to any other organisms we bring with us, wittingly or unwittingly.
Yeah, I mean, I can't help but think of it like an X-Men type scenario, where the radiation's hitting harder, the mutations are happening faster or even stronger or even at a higher rate in all these cells. And, who knows where it can go to. I think X-Men's always the positive light of where a mutation can go, an enhancement to our physical or psychological well-beings. But, we haven't seen any of that happen besides, the enhancement of, food health or food quality. I don't think we've seen like one happen yet. Unless, I think one of the big ones are the theories is the stoned ape theory, or, the addition of red meat to, humans 100,000, 200,000 years ago, or 50,000 years ago, that helped us develop in hunting, communication skills, or even the growth of our brains. I know those are, all still theories, but yeah, I don't think we've had a solid physical mutation yet, like you would see in science fiction.
Well, we have mutations happening all the time, but they're just not usually as dramatic as the kind that you see in X-Men.
Yeah.
So, yeah, exactly.
It makes good TV and good movies. Doc, thank you so much for taking time during these weird and crazy times. Please let people know where they can find you, where the best place to read or purchase your book. And if anybody on here is looking to book you, how they can get you coming to the church, university, lecture hall. Plug yourself away.
Yeah, thank you so much. No, it's really a pleasure to chat with you again, and a lot of fun to talk about all these big topics. Basically the easiest way to find me is through my website. It's solomon.rice.edu, and my last name is spelled Solomon. My book is called Future Humans, and you can find it on Amazon and other booksellers. I've also developed a complete digital course on evolution through the Great Courses, which you can find at thegreatcourses.com. And the course is called What Darwin Didn't Know. And it's all about not only Darwin and his development of his theory, but all the many things we've learned about evolution since then. So yeah, as you said, I love going and giving talks to different audiences, and you can find information on my website about how to get in contact with me if you want to have me come and talk. So thanks again. It's been a real pleasure to speak with you.
No, I'm glad I could keep up and you had a good time doing it. So if I did that, I did my job as a host. Thank you so much, everybody else who tuned into the show. If you're watching this on YouTube, go ahead, hit that subscribe button. There probably won't be links to stuff there, but go check out Dr. Solomon's book on Amazon. That's where I got it. I even had a Audible copy. Consuming stuff audibly like that is like my best way to do it. So I'll not leave a link there, but if you listen to the podcast, there will be links in bio in the description for you to see the course, to check out Dr. Solomon's book, and a place where in his email to connect with him. You click on that, it'll take you directly to an email to forward over to him. And if you are listening on this podcast app, go ahead and hit the subscribe button there. Leave us a review. Let us know how much you're enjoying the show. If you don't enjoy the show, don't put a 1-star review. Just tell me how I can improve, and I'll improve for you. And I think that's it. Everybody else, stay safe, stay healthy out there, and the bus is out. And these recordings.